I
It's
do.
working now, Ross.
It's working, Ross.
Okay, do you see my slide
Yes,
without?
perfectly.
Oh, excellent. Okay, very good. Good to meet you, Casey. I think we've exchanged a number of posts, but I think we've talked before. Okay, okay, excellent. All right, second slide. Here we go. Okay, this one should be labeled "Why do we need a manifesto?" Okay. This came about as I was thinking about what people have been writing about. Also taking a look at what the pioneering organizations have been doing. Reg and I, a couple years ago, went through this process to see the similarities and came up with a series of principles that seem to be in common. But there's also a basic shift in paradigm, the assumptions that we hold. And to a large extent, we are still embedded in the industrial era thinking. Okay. And Reg has to challenge me now and then because periodically, without thinking, I keep reverting back to that just because we spent so much time in those assumptions. So I got to thinking, what are the assumptions then that are really behind the new era? And this gets into a series of questions in on if we need organizations that are more agile and resilient. What does that really mean operationally? And what are the mindsets that uh, are really based upon the assumptions for that? There's also the question as to the vision. If you take a look at my first thought of who really forecasts the future, and I have to go back to Toffler, which I think was 1990 with Future Shock, or maybe it was even before then. It was before then, way before then. I'm sorry, way before then, 1970, I think. Okay, that's a long time ago. And there's been a number of books that have been written since. And I keep coming with deja vu. And this repeats again. Uh, Once I was going through a stack of papers that I had accumulated when I was doing my doctorate degree 20 years ago. And I started looking through some of them, and it occurred to me that what some of the authors were writing about at that time are the same things we're writing about now. And it really occurred to me the ideas aren't new. What we failed to do is put those visions into practice. Okay. Now, some of this then is the inertia of the old paradigm, which raises some questions in is if after all this time, that vision is still out there, people are still talking about and desiring that type of vision, what can we do to start moving things forward? Now, there's a number of authors that have been writing from Humanocracy, Teal, Brave New Work. Uh, Even Toffler is starting to get into, uh, uh, not Toffler, but Cotter. Cotter has started now even into more agile types of change, even moving beyond where he was with Accelerate, which is where he took his original 8 stages and kind of flipped it a little bit. Now he's moving even forward into more adaptive, more agility in his thinking. But again, those are little pockets. You've got some consultants. So, for example, Diggum from Brave New Work has a consulting operation. Uh, the different people of uh, Teal, Humanocracy, the authors behind those books are doing consulting. You've also got probably the leading organization of really pulling things together, and that's Corporate Rebels. They've done some really good work of doing an analysis of the pioneering organizations. They haven't really done a good work of generalizing what they're seeing. They've done good case studies. They're now shifting more into self-management, and they're making a major push in self-management as their focus. But they've also got an interesting investment fund where they are investing in companies and then shifting them to new ways of working and using that as a test case. And so far, they've been able to show very good progress. Of course, not everybody in those acquired companies have made the shift. Some have been, as you would expect, unable to really accept the paradigm shift itself. So you see in some cases there. The most interesting case that I'm seeing now on the horizon is the Bayer company. This is a huge company, a very mature company that has made a decision to go to self-management. Okay. Now, other companies that are very big, such as Haier Corporation, they're at that point already, but they started from a crisis and grew from there. So that's a little bit different case. And most of the pioneering organizations, when you look at them, have either been startups or they went through a crisis and a strong leader came in to turn the crisis around. Bayer is the first major company that I've seen to try to do a massive change. So far, it's early, but they're using a traditional change program to get there. But that's one that I'm watching. Okay. Any other comments at this point before we jump?
I think we might want to finish introductions.
Okay, I'm sorry.
All good.
Who has not yet introduced?
I haven't. I'm Reg, the co-conspirator of Ross. We've been beating each other up for about 6 years now, sometimes agreeing, mostly challenging. And yeah, I do a bit of writing now and again and other things around organizations, and have been involved in that from the sort of mid-80s. So quite a long time. That's the 1980s, not the 1880s.
Reg and I think about the future in a very similar way, but how we think about it is very different in how we approach it. And sometimes we struggle. Actually, what's kind of interesting, a lot of times we struggle with the words. You don't realize the impact of language until you start getting into meaning of words. And sometimes we struggle to find the right word because there isn't one, and we don't want to necessarily create new words. Okay. Others, anyone else that hasn't?
I'll introduce myself. I'm Silvia Calleja. I am a coach, so I'm not coming from the academia side, but rather working with organizations, building collaboration or helping them to find out what the purpose is and how they want to build collaboration between their members and their teams. And I came to know Ross and Reg 2 years ago and have been discussing with them ever since. They've given me inspiration about why my clients sometimes struggle to bring these ideas to life. I think they want to do it, but the reality sometimes is so overwhelming and the pace of change so fast and the day-to-day so time-consuming that good intentions get lost in the way. So yeah, that's me. And I'm based in Austria.
Right. I am Fanny Carvalho. Like I said, I'm in Houston, Texas. My first career was as a software engineer. I was a software engineer for about a decade. During my PhD studies in computer science, I ran into John Cotter's work, and suddenly the madness of why we thought we were making great software systems and adoption was so low started to make sense. There was a science behind the madness. I switched careers, and for the last 10 years, I have been working as a change management lead in large scale, usually global transformations in different industries, from high tech to manufacturing, banking, academia. I I'm especially interested in what AI is going to do or is already doing to organizations and how that will transform change management as a field.
Yeah. AI, we could go in multiple directions with that. Okay. Okay, Juan, I've noticed you kind of having some problems coming in and out. Are you with us now?
Yes, sorry about that. I mean, I don't know what happened with my camera, but I mean, it looks like it's fine now. Thank you. Sorry.
Okay, very good. Okay, let me go ahead then. And I was thinking about this. This is one of the things that woke me up in the middle of the night as to what are some of the key questions. When you take a look at all of the assumptions that I've gotten, it's multiple pages, and I've tried to narrow it down. But what I have there was some of my observations, along with what Reg and I have seen. A lot of it was from different books, different articles, the assumptions that they have, looking at the similarities, trying to come up with the common points. One question comes is, what parts of that manifesto are really essential or necessary, but may not necessarily be sufficient? So, for example, if we're going to have new era organizations, do we have to have all of those or a subset? Okay, which ones are most important? Which ones are so important that if you don't have it, you're basically going to be reverting back to an industrial era model of leading organizations? And then another part of that is, to what degree of movement in each of these is essential? So, for example, if you're shifting from a command and control leadership model into a facilitation and coaching model, okay, do you need to fully move to that model, or is it sufficient to have at least an initial mindset change that starts moving in that? And part of that goes back to a lot of times you don't necessarily need a full adoption as much as you start moving in that direction, and that starts to build momentum. So when I'm thinking about each of these components, then, which are essential, and do you have to have them fully adopted or partially adopted and moving toward full adoption? Okay. Does that kind of make sense when you look at the assumptions?
I think some of them are interconnected, and you cannot have one without the other. But if I look at organizations trying to apply this, I think it starts with mindset and commitment. And if you don't have that, then you can try and you can push, but there is going to be resistance all the time.
Okay.
I don't know how the others see that.
Sometimes what I've seen, for example, in banking, sometimes having a use case for this creates a problem, and then that moves them towards that paradigm shift. I led once a change management, a transformation, actually. They were going, the IT of the bank, they were going from waterfall to agile. So they were a very vertical 19th century institution. And suddenly the agile teams were self-managing. They had to, they decide what they're going to do in the next sprint instead of their managers. So that created a problem. And then we had to engineer a solution. And that took IT to a more hybrid model between command and control and self-management. I hope that makes sense.
Yeah. It does. It gets back to one of the issue of a lot of traditional change. One of the sayings is that you cannot change unless it starts at the top and is championed at the top. But at the same time, I greatly enjoyed working with part of an organization that was a renegade. We ran on the self-empowerment of testing boundaries all the time. And we would assume that we would have approval until told not. And we did a lot of really interesting things, but we were always testing that boundary in an otherwise very rigid organization. But there can be those conflicts when you start to push that boundary.
May I add something that is related partially with the new artificial intelligence news related to chatbots and agentic
Okay.
AI? Because I started writing an article, okay, and then just realized that it's not the technical stuff that is in impact. It's impact the culture and the leadership that involves together the way how people, senior managers or managers, will use it. So what we are doing here is also propedeutical to create a sort of cushion, okay, between the command, the control, and what is the technology that can help people to work in a seamlessly way. So this is very important to clarify now what is a middle field that can also consider what is going to do with artificial generative AI with agentic, because we have on the cusp of launching these solutions across big corporations, for what I have read so far.
Yeah, there was an interesting article recently where 25 key leaders in AI companies were forecasting what they saw ahead for 2025. And virtually all of them saw major jumps in not only use, but the types of use, going from the simple ChatGPT into agents and actually doing work. Now that's a big jump from my understanding, but what they're developing in their R&D programs, they're sensing now ready to hit the market. So
Yeah.
if that's true, there's going to be some dramatic changes that will dwarf even the significant changes we've already seen.
Ross, I think coming back to your original question, there's something that often gets forgotten when we start talking about what we should and shouldn't have in a particular change environment, who should be saying yes or no, and so forth. And that is the environment within which that organization works, not the organization itself, but the environment it works within. And increasingly, the government regulation systems are getting more restrictive. And also, many industries are requiring people in those industries, whether they're small, medium enterprises or major organizations, to work within the constraints of industrial age regulatory processes. And the auto industry is a classic example of that, where China hasn't got that restriction and they're killing the rest of the world in that business because the West and others still are stuck in those regulations. And when you actually look at them, they are so archaic, even Ford would have turned in his grave when he read them. And so before we even think about what model and how we approach it, I suggest we've got to see what that environment is, because that will be the first thing that will discriminate against where you start and how you start.
I agree. That is a critical component. That's gonna be interesting to see, because the politicians that I've observed in what they're looking at aren't even thinking about the future. They're trying to preserve the status quo and maybe favor one power center over another. Where when you take a look at the New Era manifesto, power is greatly distributed, which is going in the opposite direction of what many government regulations favor.
And if we just take a very short example of the UK at the moment, that's ideology driving all the changes, and businesses are closing down at a rapid rate because that environment does not allow any form of business to be successful. And then in 4 years' time, when that gets killed off, we go into another regulatory system. And so whatever approach we discuss and come up with needs to be able to work within that changing environment and the constraints that we know that won't change. And so, yeah, it doesn't matter whether it's the US with an incoming president and all the changes there, or whether it's in Europe with a move to a different side of politics from the increased past social systems. Those social systems are still there, and they won't change overnight. We need to take that into account.
Okay. The question is, how do you take that into account? Do you try to maintain a vision and then modify it around the edges? And maybe, to the extent possible, raise awareness of those limitations that are at the edges?
Well, I don't want to hog this, but I'll just make one comment. Whatever system you set up, it has to have that flexibility. We know the traditional hierarchical system is now taking too long and is not working as well as organizations need. The requirement for certain offices, that's positions, legal positions in Europe, are required by law, and those people are answerable there. And so as they are accountable, they're not going to let go unless we give them something that helps them to feel more comfortable. So if you get distributed decision making, which is an increasingly popular approach, how do we give those who are legally accountable, either from the local government or in some international businesses by wider bodies, the sense of security that they are able to sign off that things are working as they should. And history shows us there's many companies which have FoB'd this to their detriment, and people have been in prison and goodness knows what. So it's not saying it's one or the other, and this is where it sort of links into AI. AI can help us here, but it won't solve the problem. It's just another tool. And so when we're looking at the future of organizations, there is no one size fits all anymore, if ever there was. But it's about what design can give the flexibility we need, whether it's in Mexico, England, Spain, wherever it is, doesn't matter. That flexibility is there because each one of those has a different legal system and different requirements of the management of those organizations.
Okay. Reg, when you talk AI, what aspect of AI are you talking about?
I use that in a generic sense. Let's say the IT system, AI is increasingly a major component of that. So if you've got AI giving advice to customers and you're vicariously liable for your customer's outcome based on the advice that your AI is giving, you've got to make darn sure that it's good advice. And that goes right through the system. So from that side, you have compliance. If you get into the management systems themselves that measure the KPIs or whatever other measurements that you have, then you have to make sure, if you go away from the traditional organization where you have your silos, that the whole organization understands the situation today, not historically. You know, our KPIs predominantly today are history. They're not much good to us today. We need real-time information that links into the requirements of the environment we're in, internally and externally. And this is where AI and other technology can help us. And this is where I think we really need to think of this flexibility, because the key parts may be totally different from one industry to another and one country to another. Unless we find, Ross, some of those very core ones that won't change anywhere. And that's a tough one, I suggest.
That's a tough one. When you look at the variances, do you look at the variances by type of difference, or can you look at them from a geopolitical combination? So, for example, the U.S. Has basically a lot of similarity in their political approach and where things are going. That's very different from the European Union. But then is the UK similar enough to be the UK, European Union model, or is that another case? And then if you get into Eastern Europe, because I see a lot of this being driven by different geopolitical centers, but at the same time, there's a lot of blending that I'm not sure that grouping is going to be sufficient as much as it is to see if we can name what those differences are.
Ross, I think one prototype we could look at, it's not perfect, but it's I think it's all encompassing enough to be adaptable in different contexts, and that's the PM square format that the EU and the European Commission does for their project management. So if we took that and kind of expanded it and looked at how we could do sort of an open source change management approach that would be flexible and applicable in different contexts, that might be a good place to start. Just offering that humbly, and anything I say, feel free to tell me I'm an idiot, because I have no ego.
Okay. It's been a while since I looked at the PM square. Give me a quick overview of some of the key components.
Basically, it's the house of PM. So they have the 5 pillars instead of the 5 process groups from PMI. But the idea is it's very general, and it has less specificity than what you would see in PMP and other trainings. And that is with the design in mind, that it's going to be applied in construction and capital projects and academic projects, just sort of universally. And also, I'm not European, so I'm talking a little bit out of my ass here, and there are people who are much more qualified to tell you about it.
Casey, my memory of that is it's extremely causation driven and objective driven over linear timescales, which is classic EU. That's how they do everything. Every model that I've ever seen, and I've read just about everything they've pushed out over the years, much to my boredom. And I would suggest that if we carry on down that type of approach, then it's very hard to stop.
Right. And let me clarify, I didn't mean the approach was the model. It was the fact that it's open source, widely available, and it's premised on being applicable in broad settings. So the specifics, and I agree with you, the specifics, I don't think we need to get locked into. It's just the idea of sharing information, making it accessible. And that's also why I asked if we could do maybe a shared Google document or something like that.
Yeah, no,
and with that, I'll shut up. Sorry.
I totally support open source. Totally. I was a bit worried you wanted us to fix into some of the bureaucracy of the EU, which scares the life out of me.
Yeah. I agree totally with the open source. The shared document, we've got that ability right now within the Futocracy network. Internal is a wiki-like tool that can be structured like a table of contents that you can limit the authors, or you can make it wide open for everyone to author. We can do that right now. So for example, within the Adaptive Change Collab, I've got a wiki running right now where I'm trying to capture what we're thinking. So as discussions move forward, I want to try to document those discussions within that wiki right now as a tab called deliverables. That also then can become a body of knowledge that can be repurposed easily for articles or other use. But my main focus is not to lose that knowledge. The question to you then is, if you would like to have that ability, what do you want? How do you want to focus it? In the past, a lot of times I would save articles in one spot as a knowledge base. What's in the Futocracy Network knowledge base right now, for the most part, are old things that we talked about that I just documented, primarily so I don't lose it. And every once in a while, I will refer somebody to it when the question comes up. So the question to the group then is, if we want to start documenting, thinking, that's fine. What form, what structure would you like to start with? Knowing that it's very flexible to move things around and change the structure as well as the individual focus. What was your thinking?
I was thinking having some sort of peer review mechanism or group review mechanism for alterations. Not anything that would cause like some bureaucratic upheaval, but just to make sure that what we were adjusting or adding was in line with the greater purpose of the project, etc.
Yeah. Okay. The wiki we have really isn't like Wikipedia that tracks changes as much as you'd have to note it yourself of what changes you made, or within it propose a change. I mean, so it does require some self-regulation.
So maybe, Ross, it would be better to draft the proposed change or edit that we want to make, and then send it out before directly applying it to the document.
Okay, that's very doable. Again, the question comes is, where?
Oh, that was a question for you. I don't have a dog in the fight.
No, I understand. I think it's a great idea. I welcome it. I struggle a little bit knowing where to start as to what's the focal point, other than let it develop over time until somebody's got an interest in putting something on the table.
And maybe that's where we start, is just throwing stuff at the wall and seeing what sticks. Okay. And then that's how the creative juices start flowing, maybe.
Okay.
Well, it's just a suggestion.
No, I agree. Let me think about that, and I could easily, if something comes to mind, please let me know. Otherwise, I might, in my spare time, or one of these things that keeps me awake in the middle of the night, I get up and knock something out. May not necessarily be good, but we can take a look at it to see where it goes.
Ross, Casey, in respect of, at the moment, it's all different files with different documents. If people want to search specific things in those documents, you can always put them into the Google LLM, put your questions in, and it will dig them out for you. So there are many tools that we can use that can go through that once you've got an idea of what you're looking for.
Yeah. For that, okay, right now in the knowledge base, I've got a leading new era organizations ebook and a workbook for that. Both of those are things that Reg, Sylvie, and I have written over the years that I've kind of thrown together. It's really not a focused book of here's what we're building as much as it is capturing what has been and putting it into some sense. Now, all of that right now is being fed into a ChatGPT, a custom ChatGPT that I have running. So what Reg is suggesting is almost there right now with that ChatGPT. It does not have everything that's out there, but we're heading in that direction. So that is, that's very easy, very doable. And actually, I use that custom ChatGPT regularly just to make sense of what we've already got out there. When I've got a question, I'll ask it there, and it sorts through what we've already written to pull out a summary, and then I know where to go to better go into the detail. So again, that's doable. We're heading that direction. Okay. Let me go ahead and put a couple things on the table then. The continuous adaptation comes up frequently. And the question then comes is, what is organizational change? And where I struggle with most focus on change is that it starts when the change objective is already set and you're implementing that decision. And most of the change process then focuses on communication of a selling nature and overcoming resistance. But that selling, or the need to sell the change, and the resistance oftentimes are rooted not in the change itself as much as is the exclusion of stakeholders from the decision itself, the process that was used for that decision, and the problem solving and what the problem was. So I keep coming back to a thought that, can you really look at organizational change without also including the problem solving and the decision making, and look at it more holistic, thereby involving people in the total process, not just the implementation? Now that again also ties right into the command and control mentality of when do you involve people and how do you involve people. Okay. Thoughts?
You had mentioned in one of your posts, I believe, distributed management, right?
It doesn't necessarily have to be within distributed management. Okay. You could do it within a traditional organization. Okay. A traditional organization will oftentimes struggle with the problem because no one has authority to deal with it until such time as it becomes mandatory to be addressed. When it is addressed, a lot of times they will convene an ad hoc problem-solving group that will then investigate the problem and come forward with a recommendation or a series of recommendations for a decision maker. A decision is made as what change is required to overcome or address that problem or opportunity. And then a change process is put in place. Now, at that point, the awareness of the underlying problem can still be rather limited. The impact on all stakeholders may not be fully evaluated because they weren't involved in the analysis of the problem, nor the decisions as to, I should say, how alternatives are created. And then when the change is triggered, they'll put together a change team and a whole lot of project management focus behind that. with a significant amount on selling the need for change and the benefits of the change and how to address people that were previously locked out of the process. So you can do that right now in a traditional organization as to how people are encouraged to identify problems, how they can then bring people together. A lot of times through community of practice can be an informal organization that's already existing that can address these issues, that can then surface it and bring it up to a decision. The decision maker itself within a traditional organization can use a testing and consulting approach to decision making to bring people into the process. They can also convene an ad hoc team to actually come up with a recommendation within some constraints that can be acceptable. And the decision maker itself, while hierarchically determined, can be much more open to input from others in the process. So you don't necessarily need full distributed decision making to move in this direction.
What you described is exactly how it works. Of course, currently in nearly in all organizations that I know.
Yep.
But what you proposed in lieu of distributed management sounds to me a bit like a substitution of the committee for the grassroots or more grassroots community of practice. I don't think it solved the problem because a limited group of people are involved in the decision making anyway, and most people aren't going to be aware of it.
Yeah. This gets into one of the earlier questions I had then is, can you move in that direction or do you fully move in that direction? And if you fully move in that direction, that's much, much more difficult because you have to address all of the power centers.
I think stages, you need to set goals and move in stages. That's the only way that I've seen other major mind shifts actually work, right? So you move to different kinds. Of course, thinking,
Yeah.
I've never seen an organization do that. But the organizations that I have seen, one, go to distributed management, that's how they did it. They set that was the vision, and then they set intermediate stages. They did it in very incrementally, right? And then they got there.
Right. Yeah.
Where they would work in a hybrid way for a long time and then get there. But I think that's one way, right, that I've seen happen. I think we here would need to think a little bit more,
Yep.
Outside the box.
Ross, can I make a comment?
Yeah, please do, Reg.
I mean, what was coming over from what you said was it an either or, and I think it's not the case. I think you will always need episodic change. If your mechanical system crashes, you're going to have an episodic change, whether we like it or not. So that will always be there, and that's a classic causation linear process. That's very simple, fixed, and organizations, I think, would always need that. But if you think about discussions in the past where we said that one of the drivers of change is when leaders or managers, whatever people call them today, get so many requests from their people to do things differently that eventually it builds up and they've got to do something. These are the opportunities that are lost in an organization, which link into the continuous change concept that I think you're mentioning here, which is a very different approach. This is a connectionist approach, and it's based on effectuation. And so the difference between causation and linear and connectionist and effection are like, I don't know, apples and pears. We can't compare them, but we can actually enjoy having both if, and it's a big if, the organization decides at the beginning, how do they want their organization to work? Do they want people doing the job to be able to do it better without going through some hierarchical system which gets blocked because of other agendas, politics, and everything else in the silos? Or do we want an organization where it runs as best it can because the people who are doing the work, we're supporting them and not controlling them? And when we answer these questions and many more, I suggest we then see change as a totally different thing. And then we can talk about how do we set it up in this way. Now, I've been challenging a lot of assumptions myself on this, and I've written a lot about it. And the more I look at it, and the more I experience it from organizations, the more I believe we have to go back to basics. We can't think about how we do it today. If we're going to survive the future, which is very, very difficult to do at the moment for many, many organizations, then we've got to cast aside history and prejudices, and I'm full of them like everybody else, and start to think afresh. And that's my suggestion for this. It's not to say how it's been done in the past. It's about how do we want to help organizations do it in the future.
I think of change as very, very, very wide. Okay. And then struggle with how to define the different types of change and how to deal with them and know what direction. So for example, Reg, you said both the causation and effectuation approach, different types. You could have grassroots change to do a lot of things within the area of individual influence on others and working together, but that will not address everything. It will not address the imposed disruptions that may happen from a government regulation, nor will it necessarily address the big strategic things that kind of build up out of sight. Okay. How do you see, Reg, change from this perspective of the big picture?
Where to start? First of all, I see organizations as a community. I go back to the community ship of, was it Mintzberg, I think it was, which seemed to have got lost on the way because people just didn't understand what he really meant. And so when we start to get to community ship, we go beyond collaboration. We go well beyond collaboration. So if we want an organization to do that, we then have to say, well, how do we connect everybody in the organization as a community in a way that it's not just this reciprocal stuff that is sort of seen as collaboration today? If I scratch your back, you scratch mine. This is the way many of these silos work. We need to move beyond that. So I come back to the AI and technology. We're moving into the luxury now where every part of the organization can see what others are doing in real time in an increasing number of areas. What stops that happening is this hierarchical control business where you don't understand, the old theory X and Y stuff. I'm the boss and I control this. So you only allowed to see certain parts of the organization. So we break away from that. We go into this transparency and we start to identify what is the distributed decision and authority that everybody can have in their part of the business so that we are supporting how they do things. And if someone sees a new way of doing something, instead of going into a big room with the process experts and designing a new process, which I never run, we get into how do we realize this and who else needs to be involved? Where does it affect the rest of the organization, including our customers and our suppliers? So we start to get a different thinking, a different type of development of the people. And you build this connectionist system, just like you do with AI. Connectionism is about how AI works. And we start to have the systems to support it. And then everybody knows through the principles of the organization what they're allowed to do and what they're not. There are certain decisions, as you rightly say, that need to be made by people who are in a position to have the relevant information or the legal authority to do it. And so you develop the principles which are based on the purpose, the statement of purpose of the organization, and you go from there. And yeah, I mean, I could go on for hours and I won't.
No.
That's the difference. So that if someone sees something needs to be done differently, they talk to the people who are involved and they do it. Yeah, within a boundary that the organization allows them.
Right. Okay. Which gets back to then decision-making approach. When I take a look at the pioneering organizations, many of them seem to be moving to a consent approach. A few of them are starting to go into the advice level. I struggle a little bit with advice. Advice decision-making says that you can make any decision as long as you seek out the advice of the stakeholders involved. That's a little bit beyond my comfort level, where the consent is everyone who is involved has a voice, and it's their responsibility to use that voice to put any reasoned dissent forward. To the extent that they do not voice a dissent, then a consent is then assumed at that point. And now that requires people to use the voice and some psychological safety within the community itself. Okay. Is that kind of what the direction you were thinking in a decision making, Reg?
Yeah, it's not about going and making sure they've spoken to everybody. This is the other side of transparency. If someone says that we need to do this differently in these circumstances, then others also are responsible for saying, yes, and this is how it will affect me. It's a two-way street. At the moment, it's a top-down, but all the decision-making is being escalated up because everyone's too scared to make a decision. Whenever I go into organizations now, they say they won't make decisions. And when I look at how they're set up, I don't blame them either. Yeah, because they just don't know what they're allowed to do. And then there's this blame culture and everything else. And so this is why I come back to right at the very beginning. If the external environment is understood what's allowed by the organization, and the internal organization decides how it wants to work, then you build the rest around it. At the moment, every management book you pick up is like a history book. It's all about the other way around. Every marketing book, you start from the internal, what do we want to sell, rather than, well, where's the customer? Yeah, it's all back to front. And change is a really good example of that. It has its objectives fixed, which then they say, oh dear, things have changed. Well, there's no surprise. Yeah, no surprise. Because as soon as you start doing something in an organization, you change it anyway.
Mm.
Yeah. And so, yeah.
Okay. This then gets back to another question I struggle with then is, like, if you're talking about a new management book, we said all the old books, all the existing books are the old industrial thinking. Okay. What is the minimum viable product necessary? We talk about bits and pieces of it, but to fully understand it, you have to keep elaborating. And as you elaborate, all of a sudden you realize that you've got something that's unwieldy again, and you struggle with where to help people start. So, for example, Reg, you and I, we understand an awful lot because we've talked about it from all perspectives. But where do we start explaining this to someone who spent their entire life in a power-driven hierarchy with bureaucratic controls? We're speaking a foreign language to them.
Yeah, I mean, as you know, and I don't want to, this is not a self-publicist thing. I've tried videos and all sorts to simplify and get messages over. And so this week I've published 2 books. One's a whimsical book, like a fairy story on Alice in Wonderland, to explain how we can make sense of an environment without all the management jargon. And the other book is literally going through a leadership struggle where we have the traditional command and control causation approach, and the other one is more a connectionist and effectuation approach. And it's like a Gothic tale. And it doesn't mention jargon and stuff in there. It goes through the story of the difference and how people behave and things. I find when I do that with students, they are engaged. I've now, for my next semester, I've taken the management book that I'm supposed to use for the semester, and I've turned each chapter into a podcast, and then a podcast of the whole book. Because students don't read anymore, just like most managers don't read anymore. They'll listen to something in the car on the way, or on their headphones or earplugs or whatever. They'll listen to these things. So I'm now trying this attempt to get this over to people. And I think the day of a how to do it management book is gone, really gone. And the next stage is a trilogy of taking right the way through the phases of change, using different thinking with no jargon. Whether it will work, Ross, I don't know. I really don't.
Now, that's a storytelling approach. And history says that storytelling is one of the most effective ways of learning. So it's able to communicate, but at the same time, the story cannot be too complicated. It's got to have single points, and that falls back into my way of thinking. Then I think less of stories. I think of more key bullet points of what do I need to remember from the story to go forward, so I don't have to keep rereading the story.
I like bullet points if I'm making notes. What I find with bullet points as opposed to the story approach is bullet points then focus you to that point and not necessarily what it means and the circumstances around it. And that's why I try to avoid them. I'm guilty sometimes of using them, but I really try and avoid it because we're trying to help people see and think differently and not our view of the world. And that's where I think stories are quite good. I know that you're pushing over a message in a story, but stories, they're interpreted differently by different people. And when I get my wife to read my stuff, she sees it totally differently because she hasn't got a clue about management. Yeah. So that's what I think is good about stories, and particularly if you want to really make a change.
Other thoughts? Aura, go ahead.
Can you hear me? I was
Yeah,
trying
go
to
ahead.
find my mute button. Just on the point that you raised, Ross, I was just wondering whether the approach to sort of introducing this new concept to, for example, managers and leaders, for lack of a better words, in organizations, will be the same as introducing it to students, because I think we are dealing with sort of two different, very, very different sort of recipients of the information, right? So with students, they are, or people interested in the field, students or anyone like that, that willingly comes to learn, you can imagine them being very open to whatever you will be discussing and the new ideas and understanding the new concept, etc. Whereas when you look at the workplace, so far my experience is that managers, etc., will be very adverse to the whole concept of sort of breaking down the hierarchies and the titles that they have and all of those, the power that comes with that. So with that in mind, I'm wondering if a different approach of sort of engaging with them and getting them to understand the importance of why this transition may be required for the future of work is needed.
If I could just respond to that, you raise an excellent point. Most of my experiences with organizations since 1981, not universities, although I do that in parallel. And what I find with most managers is when you let them say what's important for them and what stops them doing things differently, a lot of it is about the environment they're in, because they're required to deliver short-term returns for shareholder value. And if you can help them understand that they don't lose their authority, they actually can be more successful by doing it differently, then many of their fears are reduced. When you get into an international company where headquarters, and I'm dealing with one at the moment, which is very command and control, one of the big consultancies has told them what to do in the very 1980s, 1990s approach, and it's killing the company. And when you actually sit just with them and listen and say, well, okay, let's think about how we can do it differently so that you actually get back your control, but in a more effective way. They are really willing to listen, in my experience. But most of my colleagues never do that. They go there giving them the solutions, and then they don't like that.
Yep. On students, I've been fortunate that the majority of the students that I've have had have all been working adults. And they're engaged because they see their learning helping them make sense of what they're seeing in the workplace. The students that lack the workplace experience, they're the more difficult ones to connect, in my opinion, because they lack the language, the context of what they're trying to learn. And it really, in all cases, there's also a detrimental effect of them being more interested in checking the boxes to get a degree as a certificate for advancement than they are in learning. So many students fail to take the opportunity to learn what's going to be beneficial to them in the future because it's not immediately beneficial to them now.
Agree totally. Sylvia, you're coaching rather than doing change. What's your answer to what Aura says? Because I really understand her position, because a lot of companies do say this.
Yes. In my experience, I think there's of course a very big fear component when it comes to change, and this sense for managers of losing power and control, and this releasing responsibility little by little to other people can be a hard process for some organizations. But I see when organizations are dealing with real problems, and they see that the way that they are working is not helping them to solve them in an efficient way, and they are tired and they are drained because of all the problems they are facing. I think it's easier for them to understand and to realize that that way doesn't work anymore and that they need to find alternatives. So then the process doesn't come as an imposed learning thing. This is the way you have to do it, and this is a solution you have to implement, but rather what is missing here from them, coming out from them, what's missing, and how can we do things differently? And then you have much more acceptance for the process because the solution is coming from the organization and not from somebody who's coming from outside. That's my experience.
Other thoughts? Let me jump forward.
I've raised my hand again, and
Go ahead.
just to Sylvia's point, just a thought that came to my mind is whether, I guess two questions, right? The first one that I'm thinking about is whether, like when I'm looking at the different sort of management layer, right? I'm really wondering if that has to be taken into consideration and if there's any difference in terms of the where you sit at the management level. And then the other thing that also came to my mind is because sometimes there are fundamental problems, you know, in organizations, and people just become quite comfortable with the finger pointing because at the end of the day, you guys just run around saying it was this one's fault, and then things eventually work out. Because I think I've even heard that before. Like when you sort of come in with sort of new ideas and all of that, they tell you, calm down, you know, it will eventually work. You know, this project will come to an end, comes water, comes thunder type of thing. So I guess those are the other two things that are coming to my head when it, oh, yeah, two things. And then the other thing that I was thinking about as well is because the discussion that we are having is about sort of the future of work, right? And to Sylvia's, just another comment to Sylvia's point is whether we will not always position it to companies that are sort of immediately dealing with major crises that will recognize that they need help for the future. Yeah, those are just thoughts. I don't know if there are even questions.
I mean, you're saying things that very often the organizations say. If you take a project, most management books still talk about the good old triangle of on time, on budget, and to specification, and you've achieved a successful project. And yet all three are fantasies. When you start the project, no one has a clue other than past experience how long it will take. The budget's a best guess, and the specification is changed en route by the client anyway. So to measure success on three variables that are wrong to start with doesn't make sense, but that's how organizations still work. Whereas if we look at it from a different lens and say, how does success really look like? The customer's happy. The workforce are really working and coordinating together and so forth. Then, well, that's success because the other things, the budget and everything else will take care of itself if those other points are happening. And so we keep looking at these objectives and outcomes through a lens of a historical approach because we couldn't tell in real time whether we were really on budget because it was historical. The old ways of setting objectives and milestones and Gantt charts and things, we only were meeting timescales on assumptions and so forth. Those days are changed. We now have the information we need in real time. So we need to look at the whole process through a different lens, I suggest. And when you actually sit down with people and discuss that with the managers, and they say, wow, I haven't got managers who can do that. And you say, well, do you need managers? And they're shocked. Of course I need managers. But when they go away and think about it, they come back very often and say, you're right. I don't need managers there. I need something different. And it's not until we have that conversation and put the past historical approaches behind us is still helpful information of the past, we can then have a different conversation. And this is my Ross and Sylvia and I are driving mad. I'm an old OD guy, and I'm old enough to have been taught by the early people who developed this in the 40s and 50s, and they were my tutors. And we're going back to OD now. We're getting out of change management and project management, which, if you look through the history of them, were developed because of shareholder value and control. And we're in a different world. And so this is why I understand your concerns. I just want to feel that in this forum we can challenge each other and help find the way forward.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yep. Okay. Reg comes from the OD, and I greatly appreciate his depth of knowledge in that area that I lack. What I struggle with is how do we do what Reg does at the scale that we need of you know
Starting.
yeah. How do we clone Reg? Because I mean there are some really good OD people that we need to use that to help people make sense of their organization. But even within the area of change, OD's been pushed to the side.
It's worse than that, Ross. They call OD now some new softwares, and they call it OD. And when I talk to managers and students increasingly, they're not able to have conversations with people, and they certainly can't listen for more than a second before they lose their attention. And so I suggest we need to go back to basics when you're looking at people who want to go into this form, whereas change management is all about courses and filling boxes and stuff like that. And it's not as good as it could be. Yeah? I'm not knocking change management. It has a role, but I think it's overplayed. And we need to get back to seeing things where the customer is not where we want them to be. And that's the OD main starting point. Be where they are, not where you want them to be. And that gets lost in change management.
Okay. From an OD perspective, there is an overall high-level process, is there not? That could be used as a framework?
Again, depends what you define as a process.
Well,
the main approach is being where they are, listening to what they say, and asking them how they would see it differently and how they would change it and what's stopping them. And then help them find the way of changing it. You only bring in quotes, expert knowledge if it would be detrimental to the client if you don't. But the main driver of the traditional OD is to help them find their solution, because then they own it.
Right.
And this means you use a totally different language with them. And we've discussed this in the past. The intervention styles, most people in management today, they're stuck in one or two intervention styles. And there are many more where you need to speak a different language with them. And that's the challenge. I agree with you, Ross, that very few people have learned how to communicate with their clients from the client's agenda and the language you need to help them make sense of it.
Okay. Obviously, now in my experience, most OD practitioners are graduate level master's or doctorate, having had several in-depth courses that equip them to do organization development. Whereas most change practitioners have had short courses and a turnkey methodology in many cases.
I wouldn't agree about the education qualifications because
Okay.
I've taken people in organizations through development for them to do internal consultancy. But certainly what I think's got lost is an understanding of the basics, the work of Mead and other people on how we really react and interact, because then that helps you identify for yourself the language and approach that you need to take in those circumstances. We get stuck in these change management, the pseudo models like the Ross curve and people like this, because they look good and they're convenient, but they are nowhere near reality, nowhere near. And what's the impact of each person in that group on each other? What's the dynamics going on in there when they're trying to find their way forward? And things like this. And you really need to understand those. And you cannot just pick a book up and do that.
I think for me, change management begins with sense making. And when people understand why change is necessary, then you can use the tools. But first you have to do the pre-work and understand what you want to do differently and why that's important. And I think that's
Yeah.
a way to really engage people. Otherwise, it's always something that's been pushed to you.
And I totally agree, Sylvia. The sense making is the term that they use in change management. The question for me is, whose sense? Are you pushing them down a road, or are you actually listening to them and helping them? And I know which route you come from, but one of my major clients at the moment, a very large consultancy was paid millions by them, and all the consultancy did was collect some data and tell them what to do. And now they're in a worse state than they were because the consultancy didn't understand them. Yeah. And this is what OD would not do. And this is what change management often does. And that's the only bugbear I've got with change management. And it's not about the people, it's about how they move in those models.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And I guess I keep coming back to wanting a way to help our organizations do what they need to do to give them a starting point and enough of guidance without having to hire people with our level of expertise to coach them every step of the way.
I have a question. I'm just wondering, sorry?
Yes, go ahead.
I was just wondering, how did we get here? Like in terms of moving from OD to like more, which is more of the understanding the people and the behavior and all of these things, to the change management, which is just sort of methods that you are implementing and without necessarily going in a lot of depth into the people and behavioral element. And then again, based on the conversation earlier, we are now shifting back into OD. And then I'm wondering if the shift from sort of the traditional OD into like what is known as change management was happened because organizations wanted it, for lack of a better word. Like they just wanted to hire consultancies who would just tell them what to do. And they didn't want to spend the time because my understanding is that OD takes time for you to sort of, go out of the sort of, this is the method that I'm going to implement. This is how we're going to get the communication through and all of those that you deal with in change management. If you have to take the OD approach, you will require a lot of time. And sometimes organizations are just not willing to pay for that. And it's also difficult to explain sometimes OD, because I think even in today's world, not a lot of people can properly define OD. Yeah, just my thoughts on that.
Or perhaps I can help you here. I've actually written the history from OD through to change, the days that project management came into being, how change management and project management joined together because they realized they're doing the same thing. And now it's drifting. When you look at the major changes, they're drifting back to OD. Now, there's this assumption that OD takes a long time. Sylvia and Ross can verify this. We were talking to some clients and I asked one question, and that was, do you need managers? The next time we met, they changed their whole way of approaching just from that one OD question. When I go into other organizations and they talk about things, in half an hour through a series of questions, I walk out and they don't need me anymore. So OD is not about long-winded things. It can be a major project. I had one that lasted 5 years, but it had 200,000 people involved. So there's this fantasy of what OD is because most people have never studied it or looked at it in detail. Change management came about because shareholder value, they wanted things done quickly. And the early days of OD were looking at holistic organizations development, not any other form. And so this is where it came in, not because the clients wanted it, but because the pressures of some organizations push them into it. And if you go, as I do, to companies now, and they say, we want to do X, Y, and Z, so what's stopping you doing this? Well, the people don't like it, so what can you do about it? And after an hour and a half, 2 hours, I say, well, you don't need me. I've just saved you a lot of money. And I say, give me a call if you get a problem. And I call them back a few months later and they say, wow, they weren't worried about it. They wanted the change and we were worried they didn't want it, but nobody asked them. And that's what OD is about. It really is. And that's another reason many don't like it, because I can't feed the family on 2-hour talks that I don't get paid for. It became a business.
Yeah, and that goes back to a combination of wanting a quick solution and a number of large international consultants willing to sell them quick solutions.
Yeah, makes sense.
Yeah, and if you look at how many of the big organizations, they have the shiny gold, the big suits go up, they sell the company a project, and then the university graduates who've no experience whatsoever come in, go through the company models, give a solution, come out and leave the chaos behind them.
Mhm.
And this happens time and time and time again.
Yeah. Yeah, the hierarchical structure within the large consulting firms are very interesting because the top level people, for the most part, do sales. Okay. We're at an hour and a half point, which was kind of my thought of ending. Any other comments, questions before we end? And I'll reschedule something in a couple weeks. Anything else? Okay. Thank you all then, and I will probably rethink a couple topics then and set up another session in a couple weeks. Okay. Have a good day and thank you for sharing today. Okay. Bye-bye.